Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome here to the launch pad. We are just awaiting the hearing to begin in the United States Senate. A committee today meeting, the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson is expected to give testimony today towards NASA's fiscal year 2024 budget and priorities. We're just going to wait for this to begin, but we're glad to have you joining us here. If you have questions, you can send those in the chat by tagging us at the Launchpad, and we'll work on doing our best to answer those. But today we're just going to be listening in and seeing some of the government work that has to be required for NASA to continue towards returning people back to the moon. Let's listen in as we await them to begin.
FY24 budget and priorities and discussions of that. For more than 100 years, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and its predecessor agency, the National Agency Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, have delivered on its commitment to make the United States of America a world leader in aviation and space. I'm not sure how many people know about the deep connection between NASA and the aviation industry, but there is a saying at the agency, quote, "NASA is with you when you fly," end quote. When many of the aircraft roll off the line in Everett, Washington, they have a quieter and cleaner engine technology developed and tested thanks to at least 2 NASA programs. So NASA has long been an important partner to the development of the 2 million strong American aviation and defense sector jobs. When it comes to space exploration, the scientific research, NASA has also been equally powerful. In 2022 alone, NASA delivered the first images from the James Webb telescope and demonstrated the Space Launch System and Orion crew vehicle that will send the first woman to the moon. The NASA DART mission even proved for the first time that this country could defend itself from a planet-killing asteroid, and every single one of these stories made national news. 2 of them have close ties to the Washington state workforce. Workers in Redmond, Washington built parts of the propulsion system for both the Space Launch System and the DART mission. And we also have several scientists who have been assigned research time on the Webb telescope. But as a Congress, we cannot afford to take NASA and its success for granted. That is why this committee and the reauthorization of the agency last year was a critical part of the CHIPS and Science Act. This was the first NASA authorization in 5 years. Now, we might say it's because our colleague is no longer with us, who was a key advocate for always getting NASA authorized, but we authorized the Artemis program and demanded that NASA establish both accountable leadership and a clear description of each element in the effort in response to concerns raised in the hearing by the head of the National Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. We directed the agency to create an independent program analysis, evaluation office, reduce the cost of delays associated with programs, and also in response raised concerns in this hearing, this time by the Government Accountability Office. And we made it the policy of the United States to maintain world leadership in aeronautics by advancing such areas as advanced materials and manufacturing. Over the course of this hearing, I look forward to hearing from the administrator about the progress of these particular areas. It is my goal to complete another NASA bill this Congress, this time with a multi-year authorization that will help ensure that the nation's leading space and aeronautic research agency has stable, predictable funding that it needs to succeed. It would be the first multi-year NASA authorization in 13 years. It should be clear to every member of Congress, we cannot operate our science agencies on the cheap, and we shouldn't operate them without clear multi-year direction. Stable growing investments in the technologies of the future, from hypersonic wind tunnels to advanced manufacturing, are the best way to protect our national and economic security. Given NASA, anything less could jeopardize our leadership in space exploration, slow down our progress on key issues as faster fuel efficiency, increase the challenges that we face at our space station, and jeopardize common sense safety actions like building redundant systems to transport astronauts. Administrator Nelson has been a tireless advocate to protect NASA's budget, so I look forward to working with him and Ranking Member Cruz to make sure that NASA and the United States keep their leadership position. So thank you for joining us today, Administrator Nelson, and now I turn it over to my colleague, Senator Cruz, for his statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. I suppose we should begin with a moment regret. You and I had a wager going about the Kraken and the stars, and last night, as these wagers, we've been on winning sides and losing sides of the wagers, but I will say I look forward to some wonderful delicacies from Washington State as we celebrate the Stars' Game 7 victory last night.
Well, congratulations, Senator Cruz. At least I told him he should show up on time if he wants to gloat, but it's okay. We're very proud of the Kraken. Congratulations to the Stars, and yes, some great salmon is coming your way, and I think some beer. Okay.
Fabulous.
Okay.
Good morning. Administrator Nelson, welcome back to this committee. All of us have spent a lot of time here. You and I have been great partners on many pieces of space legislation, and thus far, your tenure as NASA administrator has seen a number of important successes. Today, I'm looking forward to hearing an update on all things space. First, I think it's fitting to open with a note of congratulations to NASA and its international and commercial partners throughout the United States and the world, especially those partners in Texas, for all your recent successes. Like many Americans, I watched with excitement as Artemis 1 blasted off into space as the first phase of America's return to the moon. I'm thrilled that NASA has named the crew of the Artemis 2 mission: Reed Weissman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen. and I was incredibly privileged to be with you at Ellington Field in Houston for that announcement. Over the next year, they will complete their training at the Johnson Space Center for their 2024 flight to the moon. We were all equally excited about the recent test launch of SpaceX's Starship from their Starship in Boca Chica, Texas. While the, quote, rapid, unscheduled assembly was not exactly part of the plan, much was learned just getting off the pad, and we look forward to SpaceX launching again soon. Once again, Starship will help us return American boots to lunar soil for the first time in more than 50 years on the Artemis 3 mission. There's a reason the word Houston was one of the very first words spoken on the surface of the moon, and why it's one of the most common words in any astronaut's vocabulary. Johnson Space Center, in my hometown of Houston, is responsible for carrying out many key missions for space exploration. Not only is it the home of the International Space Station program, which I was glad, after years of fighting for it, that you and I together were finally able to extend it to 2023. But it is also home to Mission Control and is playing a leading role in our efforts to put a sustainable human presence on the moon and eventually put the first humans on the surface of Mars. From the Gateway Lunar Outpost to the Orion capsule to the next generation of space suits to future lunar rovers, JSC is leading the way. As a lifelong Houstonian, I am so proud of the entire team at JSC and of the entire Houston space community. This year's budget request includes even more funding for new spacesuits developed by Collins Aerospace and Axiom, and will help our astronauts ensure that they are safe and productive on the ISS, on the moon, and beyond. These two companies are just many that will make the new Houston spaceport a magnet for those who wish to help us explore the stars. Now, Administrator Nelson, for all the good things I've talked about, I do worry sometimes that we may be losing focus on what makes America the preeminent spacefaring nation. One of the reasons you and I were able to accomplish so much on this committee is both of us worked very hard to keep politics out of NASA and to focus on the core mission of exploration. Looking at this year's budget request, I see things like $22 million for the, quote, Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity, which has little to do with what you have called a space race between the free world and China. If we show up second at the Shackleton crater, I highly doubt the Chinese Communist Party will care much about how we've advanced an equity action plan. Similarly, this year, NASA, along with DOD and GSA, advanced a new climate-related regulation that requires contractors to disclose their, quote, greenhouse gas emissions, the risks they pose, and submit reduction targets validated by Science-Based Targets Initiative, a non-governmental entity. Rather than helping us win the space race, the proposed rule would ensure that NASA could do less exploration and less science for more taxpayer dollars. Earlier this year, every one of my Republican colleagues on this committee joined me in sending a letter to you, asking you to rescind the proposed rule. Your response to the letter was, unfortunately, underwhelming. I suspect that had you received such an answer when you were sitting on this committee, you would not have been especially pleased. I understand that any NASA faces pressure and political pressure from a White House. That was true in the prior administration. That's true in this administration. But one of the keys, I believe, for NASA's success is having the fortitude to press back on political pressure from either direction and to focus on the core mission. I very much hope at NASA we can continue to do so and continue to do so together.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. We'll now turn to the chair of the subcommittee and the ranking member for their opening statements. And I've asked Senator Sinema to chair the rest of this hearing. And so thank you, Senator Sinema, for your leadership on space issues.
Well, thank you, Chair Cantwell. Good to see you again, Administrator Nelson. I'm honored to chair the Space and Science Subcommittee, where I'm proud to continue the leadership that led to the bipartisan passage of the CHIPS and Science Act last Congress. I look forward to building on those historic advancements in achieving America's space and science goals. NASA has a tremendous impact on my home state of Arizona, accounting for over $700 million and over 3,800 jobs in fiscal year 2021. And that doesn't account for all the manufacturing, contract work, and growing commercial space industry that are all strengthened by NASA's work. Ultimately, American leadership in space is critical to keeping us safe, building a healthy economy, and serving as an engine to fuel rewarding careers. For the United States to remain the global leader in space, we need to ensure that Congress makes the necessary investments. That starts with NASA's initiatives in planetary defense, space exploration, Earth and space science research, and advancing aeronautic and other technologies. There are few roles of government more important than planetary defense, and I'm proud of Arizona's outsized contribution to confronting these challenges by playing a leading role in the NEO-Surveyor and NEO-WISE missions, helping to equip the planet against potentially harmful space objects and debris. It is absolutely essential that Congress fund the NEO-Surveyor program as requested in the FY24 budget request and at the appropriate levels for years to come as we approach the 2028 launch date. NASA's research is no less vital than its planetary defense missions. The state of Arizona is a vital contributor to space physics, astrophysics, and other studies through Arizona State University and University of Arizona. Both universities have successfully supported NASA science missions for decades and provide a strong pipeline for future scientists and engineers to start careers in government and commercial space. That's why our work on the CHIPS and Science Act ensured NASA's reauthorization and incorporated provisions I helped draft to direct NASA to fund key science research at Arizona's universities. We must continue to provide resources to these and other leading institutions. The scientific research NASA leads, including through the Earth Information Center and other data-related initiatives, benefits Arizonans and all Americans right now, not theoretically in the future. NASA is a critical part of efforts to combat difficulties Arizona families face every day, from water scarcity to extreme weather events and beyond. Space is no longer the exclusive domain of the federal government. Commercial space has invested heavily in Arizona, from Artemis manufacturing to the innovative new space program at Arizona State University. And just last month, Blue Origin recently opened a Phoenix office specializing in avionics, systems engineering, and supply chain management. This follows the opening of a Virgin Galactic manufacturing facility in Mesa last year, an expansion of existing facilities for Boeing and Northrop Grumman in recent years. It's absolutely essential that NASA has the resources to be an effective industry partner and that we continue to grow a thriving commercial space industry. Success in commercial space means American leadership and a center for rewarding careers. Those careers must be open to all, and this means making the right investments in STEM education. Finally, NASA needs the resources to hire and maintain a world-class workforce, which in turn requires physical infrastructure. It's our job in Congress to ensure that the taxpayer money is spent wisely, and we must therefore be critical and ask the necessary questions to any budget request. But the responsibility to spend taxpayer money wisely also means that we're making sure the money is in fact spent where it must to help keep us safe, secure, and promote a healthy economy with rewarding careers. I look forward to asking Administrator Nelson questions today and working with NASA this Congress to continue helping Arizona and the American people. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Senator Schmitt, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Administrator Nelson, for joining us here today. It's great to be with you and this committee on this hearing focused on space, NASA, and exploring the final frontier. The story of Missouri is intimately tied to the exploration of the stars. Famous astronomer Edwin Hubble was born in Marshfield, Missouri, and the telescope dedicated to his name has forever changed our understanding of the universe. As ranking member of the Space and Science Subcommittee, I look forward to working with you to progress the priorities of this committee. Of those, the one in front of us here today is NASA's reauthorization, and I'm eager to work in a bipartisan fashion with you and the full committee, chair and ranking member, to hopefully get that across the finish line. Here in the United States, we're privileged to have a robust commercial supplier base at the foremost space flight companies in the world. Over 20 Missouri-based companies from Joplin to Hazelwood are actively supporting the Artemis mission to return man to the moon. As ranking member of the Space and Science Subcommittee, I want to do everything in my power to leverage the abilities of innovation that the U.S. companies possess to maintain American space dominance. It's imperative that the U.S. and the appropriate agencies develop thoughtful, common sense standards when it comes to the development and deployment of technologies related to orbital debris management, commercial space stations, and other deep space waypoints, hypersonics, human landing systems, and the numerous other technologies necessary to get us back to the moon and beyond to Mars. I can't emphasize this enough. So much of this developing technology is just that, developing. Sadly, the default approach around this town, in my view, is what more can the government do, not less innovation thriving under the light torch of regulation, not the heavy hand of government. While I still have a lot to learn in this space, no pun intended, I, along with my staff, continue to hear from industry about how knee-jerk and untenable regulations have stymied U.S. leadership. This shouldn't be anyone's goal, especially as foreign adversaries seek to undermine our efforts at every corner. On that note, I want to speak about the near and present danger of China. China's capabilities in space and beyond is alarming. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit the following articles entitled, "A Chinese Spacecraft Has Been Checking Out U.S. Satellites High Above Earth, and China Building Cyber Weapons to Hijack Enemy Satellites, Says U.S. Leak," which highlight the ability of the CCP multi-directional satellites to stop and gather intel on U.S. space equities, and the CCP's development of cyber weapons to seize control of U.S. space equities. While I commend the administrator for the many initiatives he will highlight in his testimony, I strongly disagree with this administration's obsession with misguided woke policies related to climate change and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Administrator Nelson, America cannot afford to take its eye off the ball with the rising threat of the CCP. There is simply too much at stake. President Xi and the CCP are hell-bent on dominating us on every front. We must be laser-like focused on our approach, and I can assure you that China has no interest in out-DEIing us, and they're not intimidated at all by this divisive, radical policy that's found its way in this budget. Madam Chair, thank you again for convening this hearing, and thank you to Administrator Nelson for appearing before us today. I look forward to today's hearing and the proceedings. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, and without objection, we'll enter those articles into the record. We'll now turn to questioning, and Administrator Nelson, I wrote to you in January about a Manufacturing USA Institute, something that NASA could inform. It's really an action that NIST would take. But in my state alone, we're looking at 60,000 STEM worker shortfall by 2026. And this notion of continuing our efforts on material science, I believe, is a key aspect of where we need to go. So NASA, NIST, industry need to continue to collaborate on what I think is training and skilling people in material sciences. Do you agree that NASA should help and work on these issues?
Indeed, I do. And another thing that you were looking at is thermoplastic composites as a new material that would not only help aviation industry, but also the space industry. And we have a NASA project going on high-rate composite aircraft manufacturing. And we are working with the partners, obviously those in Washington State as well, to reduce the cost and increase the production rate of composite aircraft. You know, the Dreamliner, the 787, is built of composites, and it has a lot of advantages, including a weight advantage. And so this is a new kind of composite. So at your request, Madam Chairman, NASA Commerce, Defense are developing recommendations to leverage the manufacturing here in America to accelerate our capabilities in manufacturing aerospace technologies like thermoplastics.
Thank you for that answer. I think there are some that believe we're falling behind to where Europe is on this R&D side of the equation, so thank you for your answer on that. I'd like to ask a couple of other things. Obviously, you and I have had many conversations about NASA's need to continue with redundancy and making sure that we keep programs, on schedule and reduce risks, and also the fact that we need a multi-year budget. The President's 2024 budget for NASA is 7% increase over 2023, but your requested increases in the out year appear to be only 2% or less. So we think here in discussions, getting a 3 to 5 year authorization would help NASA on making sure that we don't fall behind in what we need to do to be competitive. And thank you for your detailed answer on thermoplastics. Many of our supply chain are making thermoplastic products today for the space sector, and so we appreciate that answer. But could you talk a little bit about a multi-year request and how do we stay competitive and redundancy?
And I commend you for a multi-year proposal. It's true that the last NASA authorization bill, as Senator Cruz has mentioned, the two of us fashioned that. That was back in 2017. It's true that before that, one of the primary drivers was the NASA bill of 2010, which Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas and I fashioned, that set us off on this course of the dual approach in our going back to the moon and to Mars. One track is government, the other track is commercial. And so I would welcome a multi-year approach to appropriations instead of in the past where it's been, you get into the negotiations between the House and the Senate, and then you all can't agree on this, and you have to accept what they want, but that's not the comprehensive approach. I think what you've said, a 5-year authorization bill would be very, very well received in the aerospace community.
Thank you. Senator Sinema, I'll turn the hearing over to you, and thank you for chairing. Oh my gosh. Totally forgot your opening statement.
Well, I was going to shorten it, and
Totally. I jumped right into questions, and so we had such a dynamic here of members talking about all these priorities. Sorry, I apologize for not giving you the opportunity to make a statement.
Madam Chairman, if I could hit some of the topics that
Please, go right ahead, Administrator.
Oh my gosh. Raised in your opening questions. First of all, we've talked about aviation, and you're so right. And there are big things happening in aviation. Just for example, in Washington State, we have just announced with Boeing basically the plan to design the next 737 aircraft, which is the one that is most frequently used, single aisle, medium range commercial transport. But this time, we're going to do it by working with Boeing of designing a high, thin wing, high on the fuselage. And it's so thin that it needs struts to support it. But what this design is doing is giving, along with the improvement in the engines, a 25% greater efficiency. And Senator Cruz, that would mean 25% less fuel, which is a good thing for the airlines, but might also be a good thing in the overall energy policy of the country. Senator Cruz, you mentioned the GHC. You and I, in this committee, have a different approach to what is happening to the Earth's climate. It so happens that NASA is in the middle of this. Why? Because all those assets up there, we design them, we build them, we launch them, and we operate many of them. Others we turn over to, like NOAA, and NOAA then, of course, has the National Weather Service. Now, the fact is that they are recording what is happening to the Earth. And what you're specifically referring to is in 2022, the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council published a draft rulemaking. That's in the draft. There are 3 agencies involved: NASA, Department of Defense, and I think it's, which one? GSA. And so it's in the middle of taking comments. But there is a provision in there, if this will give you some satisfaction, there's a provision in there that I, as the NASA administrator, can waive any requirements that might be in the rule with regard to small business. And small business is something that we take very seriously in our contracting and so forth. So I would ask you to continue with your advocacy of that position, but look at the details in the proposed rulemaking, and it is in the hearing stage, accepting comments. Senator Sinema, I brought show and tell. You raised this issue. This is DART. This was incredibly successful. We wanted to see if we could hit bullseye, an asteroid. So we chose an asteroid that was about 100 meters in diameter, that was orbiting about another asteroid that was about a half a mile in diameter. Because if we hit it, we could then measure with our telescopes, did we move it? This is DART. The size of DART is 4 by 4 by 4. So it's a relatively small spacecraft. But that spacecraft hit that 350-foot wide asteroid at 16,000 miles an hour, right on the money. And sure enough, it changed the orbit of that. And therefore, we wanted to see if we could hit, if we discover a killer asteroid that's headed for Earth, would we have a chance of altering its trajectory by hitting it? And that brings this one, Arizona State, NEO Surveyor. This is a 3D printing of what is the spacecraft. It's obviously much, much larger than this. And it will go in 27, and it's going to be looking out there for killer asteroids that would endanger us. So this program, primary principal investigator is Arizona State. I've been there, I've talked to them, and so I wanted to bring you all up to date on that. And Senator Schmitt, you raised the issue of China. We are in a space race with China. The staff of this committee has already received an intelligence briefing, and I would encourage you all to get that briefing to understand just how serious this space race is of getting on the moon. And I have said many times that it's my old country law practice days. Possession is 9/10 of the law. it is always possible that to get to the area that we're going to, the South Pole, where we think the resources are on the moon, especially water, and of course, if there's water, there's hydrogen and oxygen, and you got a gas station. I would not want us to be there second, because what is to say, if you recall the history of China, of the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, and suddenly they're claiming that's their territory. I would not want to see them get there first and then claim this is our territory in the South Pole, you stay out. We go as an international mission. We go with international astronauts. We go with international participants in our scientific instruments. I want us to get there first.
Thank you, Senator.
Chairman,
Thank you for that passionate opening statement, Administrator.
I didn't get to the budget, which you asked about.
We will get to that. I want to turn to my colleague, Senator Cruz, and then we will, again, thank Senator Sinema for chairing the rest of the hearing and for her leadership. She mentioned CHIPS and science, and that was a key aspect of CHIPS and science. She played a key role in helping us get it over the goal line, and so appreciate your focus this morning. So, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as I said, it's good, Administrator Nelson, to have you back in the committee. It's unusual to have you on that side of the dais.
And by the way, thank you for coming to Houston for the announcement of the crew. This is a big deal. And by the way, the crew is here today,
good,
and tomorrow and Thursday. And it's my understanding that I'm going to be able to bring them to the Republican luncheon on Wednesday. So I'll look forward to you seeing them there.
Excellent, and they are so incredibly impressive, and we are proud of the courage that they bring in this incredibly important mission going back to the moon, but also keeping our eyes focused that Mars is the objective, and getting to the moon is an integral part of proving up the technology to go to Mars. I want to start by asking about NASA has a long history of phasing down programs. And we saw with the space shuttle, with Constellation, that there can be real bumps in a phase down. At some point, the International Space Station is going to need a phase down. We have extended the time on that till at least 2030, but at some point, that's going to have to happen. How do we avoid a brain drain? And how do we maintain the technical expertise and leadership we need when that time comes?
First of all, understand that among young people, which we actively recruit in our intern program, the excitement about space, I often say space is the place, but that's not some light statement. Look at any classroom in America and look at the excitement in the areas of engineering and mathematics and technology and science. And it's real. And what better way to get the young people of the country motivated than the space program? It was that way 50 years ago in Apollo, and we are reviving that now again with Artemis. So I think as then specifically to your question, how do we keep this going? In large part, it's going to depend on you all and the challenges that you all have in the next couple of weeks, and then the challenges as you get up to September the 30th on the appropriation deadline for the next fiscal year 2024. But if the resources are there for us, then we're going to have this continuing program of going back to the moon, this time to learn to live, to work, to invent, to create for the purpose of going further, going to Mars. That is going to generate a lot of excitement. When you combine that with all the science that's going on, I just mentioned DART and NEO Surveyor, the James Webb Space Telescope, and the discoveries that it's bringing, you mix all of that together, and there's going to be a continuing interest.
You just rightly noted that one of the challenges of ensuring NASA's exploration focus are the constraints of resources, and that's always been the case. It's worth noting that NASA's acquisition management has been on GAO's high-risk list for years. And GAO noted last year that, quote, continuing a recent trend, NASA's portfolio of major projects experienced significant cost and schedule overruns, and more projects were added. That's one of the reasons why I and every Republican member of this committee is so concerned about the proposed new greenhouse gas rule. It's estimated that rule will increase costs among federal agencies across the board by almost $4 billion, a significant portion of which will likely be borne by NASA. Has NASA done any calculations? Have you measured how much this new proposed rule will drive up the cost for all the companies that do business with NASA, and in turn, how much more that will drive up NASA's expenses and remove dollars that otherwise would be available to go to the moon or to go to Mars?
In the process of the rulemaking, they are receiving comments, and then I'll be able to answer your question specifically. But we can't deny that NASA deals with climate, and therefore it deals with these greenhouse gases. That's what we have the instruments up there taking these measurements.
But Administrator Nelson, my question is just how much are y'all driving up costs because of a political mandate from the White House? I'll give you another example.
I'll get you an answer.
One of the, quote, works in progress under, quote, safety, security, and mission services within the budget is to implement a 5-year plan to transition NASA's entire fleet of more than 2,600 traditional combustion vehicles to all-electric vehicles. Has NASA done any cost estimate as to how much it will cost to get rid of 2,600 combustion vehicles, replace them with electric vehicles, and then install the charging infrastructure everywhere that will be needed for those vehicles?
I'll get you an answer. But if you're suggesting that we should abandon the entire national effort to move toward electric vehicles, I would say that there's a significant difference of opinion about that.
What I'm suggesting is NASA should stay focused on its core mission of going to space and going to the moon and going to Mars. And the extent to which, I understand this is a very political White House. I understand most White Houses are. The extent to which NASA salutes and jumps on board with those political objectives, that will significantly undermine not only the ability of NASA to have the resources it needs to keep building things to go to space, but it also, we've worked very hard, you and I have worked very hard to keep NASA out of partisan politics, and I would encourage you energetically to continue that work because we've got a Republican House of Representatives now. If NASA is seen as partisan, that is very bad for space and space exploration, and so I hope NASA will continue its tradition of staying out of those battles.
And I assure you, NASA is and will be, if I'm around, not only bipartisan, but nonpartisan. And it will continue that way. Now, the reality is, Senator Cruz, and you know I love you, it's the fact that we have political differences. And it was on display in this very room over a number of years. But I can guarantee you that NASA is being run in a nonpartisan way.
Thank you. Welcome again, Administrator Nelson. I'll now recognize myself for a few questions. I am proud of Arizona's longstanding leadership in planetary defense, including addressing the threats of destructive near-Earth objects, or NEOs, as you've discussed. In fact, the Catalina Sky Survey and Space Watch at Kitt Peak in Arizona have detected more than half of all of the identified NEOs. Unfortunately, to date, NASA has only identified approximately 42% of the NEOs larger than 140 meters in size that could cause a devastating impact should they hit the Earth. This is far less than the 90% by 2020 that was required by the 2005 George E. Brown Jr. Near-Earth Object Survey Act. However, the NEO Surveyor mission, led by Professor Amy Meinzer at the University of Arizona, would dramatically increase the rate of discovery of NEOs through a space-based infrared telescope optimized to find, track, and characterize NEOs. Now, I've strongly supported funding for this mission in the past, and I want to ensure that it's adequately funded to fly before the March 2028 deadline. So why is this year's $209.7 million budget request for the NEO Surveyor mission, as well as continued support for additional funding in the future years, so essential to meet the statutory requirements and protect our planet from potentially harmful objects?
We cannot identify every object. However, NEO Surveyor will be able to identify 90% of all the potential asteroids that are greater than 140 meters wide within the 10 years of the launch. Now, that's important because when you think of an asteroid that will do serious damage, millions of years ago, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs was about 6 miles wide. If we can identify 90% of the asteroids that are 140 meters wide, then we're well on our way. But that's the technology that this will enable us to do, and launching it in 27. By the way, there's a similar problem. Look at all the junk in Earth orbit. There are a lot of pieces up there that are big, and they can do damage coming down through the atmosphere because they don't all burn up. We can only identify with existing technologies pieces that are larger than that in width. But something like that coming back through the atmosphere can still do a lot of damage.
Thank you. Is NASA on track to meet the March 2028 launch readiness date required by the CHIPS and Science Act?
Are we talking about silicon chips? Is that what the question is?
So the CHIPS and Science Act required that NASA meet a launch readiness date. This was part of the reauthorization package that was inside CHIPS and Science. And the idea was that you would be ready to launch by March of 2028.
Which mission are we asking?
I think you're the surveyor, the NEO surveyor.
Isn't it going in 27? 28.
We're on track?
We're on track.
Great, thank you. Arizonans face tremendous challenges from urban heat, water availability, and wildfires. And as you know, the CHIPS and Science Act directs NASA to pursue Earth System Observatory missions. So how will you ensure that these missions advance the critical science that will allow Arizonans to better plan, avoid, and mitigate these challenges?
Well, the specific question is about, would you state that again?
Sure, thank you. So how will you ensure that NASA's missions around Earth System Observatory missions actually advance the critical science that allows Arizonans to better plan for issues like urban heat, wildfires, and water?
Okay. There are 4 great observatories that we're going to put up over the course of the next decade that will do what you just described. the Earth System Observatory. As a result of these, and by the way, this is part of the science budget that I would urge you all to continue on. As a result of these, we are going to have a 3D compendium of everything that is happening to the Earth in its land, in its water, in its atmosphere, and its ice, and how that is affecting everything on Earth. For example, I had gone to Kansas for Senator Moran. And one of the reasons I wanted to go is that we have systems up there, including Landsat, but so much so with this Earth System Observatory that the chairman has just mentioned, that can tell a farmer in his particular pasture, crop, that particular segment of land, what is the moisture content of the soil. And as a result, it has the applications here on Earth. All the more so when we put up these 4 great observatories, giving us an understanding of what is happening to the Earth so much greater. I'd just add one other example, and that is we can tell, for example, disease in crops, but also disease in trees. And so we can warn that there's likely to be a wildfire in a particular forest as a result of the vegetation that we're detecting from space is being diseased.
Thank you. Senator Schmitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's good to see you again. We had a great visit in my office, and I noticed you already pulled out the "I'm just a country lawyer" line earlier, which is one of my favorites. But anyway, it's good to see you again. I did want to ask you, you know, NASA has such a great tradition and reputation as it relates to working with private industry for the development of new technologies. And you see this kind of innovation, and it's only continuing to grow. And we're on this, I mean, space has always been referred to as the final frontier, but that we're continuing to push that envelope, which is great. Could you give the committee, or the 3 of us, I suppose, an idea of what you're doing or some specific efforts that you've employed as commissioner or the agency in general to help foster that kind of innovation as opposed to being an impediment? Because this is one of the, you know, obviously the great concerns is government getting too involved, potentially stymieing some of that innovation. And this is, you know, with space, I appreciate your comment earlier about China. I serve on the Armed Services Committee as well. And, you know, China is playing for keeps, and space is, you know, sort of ground zero for that competition that we're in. So just if you could walk through some of the things that you're doing that help foster innovation as opposed to hinder it.
Our seed corn is research and development. We don't want to ever give that up. And that is the mission of NASA. It may be in space, it may be aeronautics, it may be in climate by what I just described. It may be looking for asteroids. It may be trying to understand these phenomenon that you are being briefed on in the Senate Armed Services Committee on UAPs. It's got a new name, unidentified anomalous phenomena. It may be all of this, but it's the research and development that allows this country to move forward. So we see it in so many things. The reason it's going to accelerate and sustain itself is we do it not just as a government agency, but we do it with our commercial partners and now our international partners. And that all brings to the table a new mix of research and development. Whether we're talking about space, let's take the example there of going back to the moon. Now we go and have already demonstrated without a crew on the test flight. The Artemis mission #1 and the spacecraft Orion flying around the moon. We are putting a crew on, but we go with commercial partners because the third mission, we're going into lunar orbit. We're going to start to establish a lunar space station, and we are joining up with a commercial lander. The first winner of the first competition was SpaceX. We have a second competition that is just coming to a close, and the winner of that competition, so will be announced very shortly. And so we will have 2 landers. And therefore, it's a public-private partnership. We also, to go back to the moon this time in a different way, we go with our international partners. That wasn't the case half a century ago. We did it as the U.S. government. This time, even on the first crew, the ones that are coming here to Capitol Hill today, our first international astronaut is Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian F-18 Royal Air Force pilot. And so it's the beginning of these international crews. Now, on the International Space Station, we've been having international crews there ever since the late 1990s when we opened up the International Space Station.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm limited on time, but I do want to make the point in following up with some of the comments from Senator Cruz. He was talking about climate, and you've indicated that China is a serious threat competitor here. In the budget, it is worth noting that China is mentioned one time in the budget. Les Mis, I hear the ringtone. China is mentioned one time, but climate and DEI-related items are mentioned 153 times in the budget. So we talk about priorities, not that that's the litmus test, but my concern is, and also serving on our Armed Services Committee, we've had, with the leadership of Senator Wicker as the ranking member, had a lot of questions to some political appointees to those positions about, again, this obsession with this political ideology. And NASA has had such a great reputation. I do not want to see NASA dragged into these political fights and the politicization that dominates everything. NASA has no business in that. So it's more of a comment than a question. I would urge you to rethink this administration's obsession with this divisive ideology that's now finding its way in military budgets, NASA budgets, and I just think it's completely wrong-headed. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Wicker.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to see you again, Mr. Administrator, and I congratulate you on the great work you're doing. It may come as a total shock to you that I would want to ask about the Stennis Space Center. But you and I have worked on this world-class facility in the past, and I understand you have some words of encouragement about Stennis and other space centers as we transition to a different phase of NASA's long and a very vital career. So what could you tell us on the record about that?
The Stennis Space Center is a very valuable national asset because it is the location that when we are developing exquisite new engines, we have to go to test them. And it is strategically located so that huge rockets can be delivered there on barges on the canals that once tested and their motors in the integrated form can be put back on the barges and sent to the launch site, wherever the launch site is. Now, the testing of rocket engines is not going to cease. It's going to continue. But they're new kind of rocket engines. So it's not just government rocket engines. It's now commercial rocket engines. Because indeed, there is a very viable commercial space industry. Now, not only satellites, but also rockets that are finding cheaper ways to get up to orbit because of exquisite new materials and manufacturing techniques. So I see a very bright future for the Stennis Space Center. And that future, I think, includes, because Stennis has so many thousands and thousands of acres of land, so that its testing does not disturb the surrounding community. I think it becomes a multi-user space center, test center, that will be utilized by many other users other than the U.S. government. But beyond NASA, I think in the U.S. government, there are many other users in the U.S. government that will test in the future and, in fact, are beginning to test at Stennis.
Okay, well, let me then transition to another aspect of this, and that's the budget for rocket propulsion testing. It has held steady. I would have preferred and been more reassured if that had been increased over time. There's only a 0.8% proposed increase from FY23 to FY24. Where do you see that going? And given the unfunded infrastructure projects at our rocket propulsion test centers, is this funding request going to be sufficient to sustain the programs?
I want to see it increase. And thus, all the more reason that you all need to keep us out of budgetary chaos. And I'm not talking about in the next few weeks. I'm talking about also when we get close to September the 30th and we need a new appropriations bill. Your question specifically is, are we going to have increased need of increased appropriations in order to provide the testing facilities for our space rockets? And the answer, in large part, is up to you. By the way, we have $5 billion of unmet needs on infrastructure. Fortunately, we were able to address some of it in an emergency appropriations for both Michoud in New Orleans as well as Stennis because of the hurricanes. So in a hurricane supplemental, we were able to repair damage. But this is throughout all NASA's 10 centers and 10 facilities. We are sucking air when it comes to the needs of infrastructure.
Okay, well, I appreciate your answer, and Madam Chair, I'll yield back in a sentence or two. But I think what I hear you say is that, yes, we could, and in fact need some additional appropriation in order for these testing facilities to meet the needs that we have. I certainly agree with you when you talk about continuing resolutions and the way they do not meet the needs and in fact waste billions and billions of dollars when we're forced to continue under last year's plan rather than move forward on what is actually needed. So I appreciate you working with us on this, and of course, you don't have a stronger supporter of the Artemis program and the space programs than many of the members on this side of the dais. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Nelson. Yeah, we've got some sort of a space object between us. You've referred a little bit to some of the risks and dangers of debris, the Orbits Act, which passed the Senate unanimously in the 117th Congress, would jumpstart a partnership with industry to figure out how we're going to develop the technologies to get this debris out of the LEO. I think it's critical for tackling this problem that continues to grow. Now, other nations, including European nations, the Japanese space agencies, have all established dedicated programs to advance their own debris removal technologies. Can you describe NASA's current efforts to address orbital debris and what you could call the orbital debris crisis? And how does NASA plan to maintain its global leadership in active debris removal?
It is a real problem, and we're going to have some catastrophic consequences if we can't get nations that are launching things into space to provide enough fuel to have a controlled reentry. And in fact, to have a reentry so that all the junk is not sitting up there. One of the obvious examples is the ASAT test that was done by China a decade ago, put tens of thousands of pieces right in that zone of altitude of where a lot of our spacecraft are, and indeed our International Space Station. Most recently, Russia as well. About a year ago, did an ASAT test, unbelievably putting junk into the very altitude where the International Space Station is, which they built with us and operate with us with their cosmonauts on board. And in fact, we have had to move the space station to a higher elevation to get out of the way of junk that we can identify. And earlier in the hearing, I was saying that we can identify in low Earth orbit objects that are that long or greater. But smaller stuff, we can't even identify it. And it is a real threat. I mean, a speck of a paint chip coming at the right velocity, at the right angle, you can imagine what it could do to a space suit on a spacewalk of an asteroid. So there's got to be not only our effort, and it looks like we have to lead the international effort, to be serious about designing everything that we are launching, that it has a minimal amount, preferably none, amount of junk that is going to be up in space, either to let it degrade and burn up on reentry or to get it into a higher graveyard orbit where it's not going to threaten anything.
Great, I appreciate that. We're working on it as well to try and provide you the resources to make sure that technology does get developed in this country. I'm going to let you free range a little bit just with the last question, because you only have about 40 seconds. We have a whole bunch of over 200 Colorado companies have played a role in the successful Artemis 1 mission, supporting the development of a space launch system and the Orion spacecraft. The Capstone satellite is owned and operated actually by a Colorado company, Advanced Space. I think they're still orbiting the moon as we speak, sending back critical information for the Artemis mission. So just giving you an open palette, can you describe the value of the public-private partnership in our return to the moon? How is NASA engaging our industry partners to keep the human landing systems and the Lunar Gateway on budget and on schedule? And you only got to have about, maybe you'll get 5 extra seconds. You might have to, actually, I should refrain that. You might have to respond to that in a written sense now that I see that the...
Well, I can't say it in 5 seconds, but I can say that that mission that you're referring to, it's characterizing the orbit that eventually our gateway or space station will go in.
Right.
It is it's a Colorado company that in fact did manufacture the spacecraft. And what's illustrative, it was launched by a private rocket company that, albeit an American company, also it was launched from a foreign location, in this case, New Zealand. Rocket Lab is the company. And it is providing exactly information that we need, that the government didn't have to do it, but we need that information about this new orbit that we're going to put our gateway space station in lunar orbit.
Yeah, that's great. We're big fans. I yield back. Thank you.
Senator Budd.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Administrator, thank you for being here today. It's an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service. You know, this committee, as you know, is working through the FAA reauthorization. And one area that I hope gets a lot of attention is next generation aviation technologies. You know, in your testimony, I believe you mentioned the X-59 low-boom supersonic aircraft program under NASA's Aeronautics research arm. So that flight program could help unlock next-generation commercial supersonic flight through reduced noise pollution. For example, in Greensboro, North Carolina being the great state that I get to represent, Boom Supersonic plans to manufacture a commercial supersonic airliner that will revolutionize travel. So what's the current status of the X-59 low-boom program, and specifically, how close is NASA to meeting its goals on designing and building the research aircraft and flying it over the U.S.?
And your state is first in flight.
Thank you for that.
The X-59, which is this extraordinarily super designed, needle-nosed aircraft, is going to fly at the end of this year. It'll fly at Edwards Air Force Base. Maybe, let's see, it's coming out of the Skunk Works at Palmdale, but I'm pretty sure it's going to fly at Edwards. And what it will do is what you just said. It will fly supersonic, but its design is such a radical design that instead of pushing the bow wave going through the atmosphere, as you go from subsonic to supersonic, which causes that audible sound that goes boom, boom. It will, because of the design, as you go supersonic, it will be a muffled roar. And the whole thing is just what you said, designed to allow us to travel supersonic over populated areas. An obvious one would be from coast to coast. Now, back in the old days, when they had the French Concorde, which was Mach 2, 2 times the speed of sound, they'd fly supersonic over the ocean. But when they got to the shores of either Europe or any other location, they had to slow down subsonic because of that boom being such a shattering sound.
So you hope to fly by the end of the year out of Edwards or Palmdale, but what data do you hope to collect, and how could a successful demonstration clear the way for aircraft manufacturers like Boom in North Carolina, hopefully not just first in flight in our state, but first in supersonics? How could that help them to have regulatory certainty that there's going to be a market for overland supersonic flight?
Well, as a matter of fact, specifically on that question, there are, in fact, private companies that are getting into the business now of supersonic transports, but they don't have this characteristic. So your question essentially is there a market out there in going into the headwinds from coast to coast that would normally take you 5, 6 hours. Is there a market out there to cut that almost in half? And I suspect there is. And if you can do that, now you ask also about the testing. This thing is first going to be tested to make sure it flies. And then once they get through that, what we are going to do is a multi-year test, taking it to different locations all over the United States, and see if the muffled roar is acceptable to the people on the ground.
So, Administrator, that's the data you're looking for to see if it's acceptable to the public for overland flight.
That's correct.
Thank you. Chairwoman, I yield back.
Senator Lujan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Administrator Nelson, thank you so much for being with us today and for your continued service. Over the past several decades, Congress has created several agency-modified nonprofit research foundations. Some of those examples, Administrator, are the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Food and Agriculture Research Foundation as well, and most recently the Department of Energy Foundation for Energy Research and Innovation. I believe that a foundation at NASA might help attract more partnerships, more public-private ventures and investments. And so my question, Administrator, is with an appropriate mission and funding, do you believe that NASA could benefit from a foundation to help develop public-private research partnerships? And would NASA be able to use a foundation to enrich public education on space and provide awareness of its role?
I don't know the answer to the question. I do know that, Senator, we do everything that we can to partner with not only commercial industry, but also universities and other academic institutions. And it has been enormously successful. And the proof's in the pudding. You look at, for example, commercial crew to the International Space Station. That has cost NASA significantly less. Our partner, in this case, SpaceX, soon to come, Boeing, with their Starliner, which should fly later on in the year for the first time with crew. It's on a fixed price contract, and it delivers crew and cargo to the International Space Station. That was an employment of commercial activities, ingenuity, creativity in a way that NASA had never done, doing it all as a government program in the past. So too, in our science research, we join up with commercial ventures as well as academic institutions. We put out a lot of grants, and we specifically, by the way, considering your state, we put those grants into areas that don't normally identify with the aerospace communities, because we want the creativity of, in one example, rural communities. That creativity to be brought forth in the scientific research. So I think we've got the approach of a public-private, for that matter, international partnerships now that we're getting the biggest bang for the buck.
I appreciate that response, sir. You're familiar with NASA White Sands Test Facility out in New Mexico, Administrator, which was established back in 1962. It's 94 square miles located on the western slopes of the San Andres Mountains, which is 18 miles north of our largest city in the area, Las Cruces, New Mexico, and has supported the testing of spaceflight equipment for decades. Unfortunately, we know that site operations resulted in the release of hazardous substances, including volatile organic compounds from tanks and impoundments used to store waste materials. Now, NASA is currently stabilizing the contaminant, grow any bigger, but NASA's own modeling shows this method isn't effective at removing all of the contaminants. Even after running the system for 100 years, model simulations show that contaminants are still present. Does NASA believe that it has a responsibility to fully remove the contaminants from the groundwater?
Yes, sir.
And Administrator, can we expect NASA to identify additional restoration actions?
As a matter of fact, we've already spent $200 million to date to address this groundwater contamination problem, and we are committed to continuing the investigation and the evaluation along with our partner, the New Mexico Environment Department.
I appreciate that, sir. And Administrator, I'd like to follow up with you and your team on this particular issue. It does matter to us, and there's been communication from myself and United States Senator Heinrich in the past, going back to 2022, to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army asking about their role and responsibility. And at the time, the response that came back to us said that it was too early to assess damages. It's been about, we're going to be coming up on a year here soon, but just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. So I look forward to following up with you, sir.
We're on the same page, and NASA owns and operates that local public water system. So we have every reason to continue this investigation.
I appreciate that, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. Administrator Nelson, we have a few senators who are on their way back. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a few questions while we wait for them to arrive. The last time I was asking questions, I was asking about the CHIPS and Science Act as it relates to Arizona's unique climate issues, such as water and heat, urban heat. So I want to kind of pick up on that. My question for you now is, how will NASA ensure that all the data that is gathered through the Earth System Observatory, how can we ensure that it's available to all states and tribes, researchers, et cetera, in a timely manner, so that in Arizona we can address issues like urban heat and water availability? As you recall, the CHIPS and Science Act requires that that data be provided. Does NASA have a plan to do so in a timely manner?
Yes, ma'am. And let me give you a specific answer to your question. Knowing that we have this great observatory that is being put up with 4 additional elements in addition to what we already have, and the specificity of information of what is happening to the Earth and its climate that will result therefrom, yours truly said, we've got to get this information out to everybody. And I knew the concept of a mission control center where everything is on display. So I said, why can't we do this for all the information that we're bringing in from all of these assets that are up in space? What has come to be is our request that was funded the first time last year. We're asking for that funding this coming year. The Earth Information Center. And I see that not just as a physical location in many different locations where people could go, but I see that being offered virtually to everybody. School children, international partners, everybody. We're going to get a first glimpse of this because we have taken the east lobby of our building, which is a stone's throw from here, about 4 or 5 blocks away. And we are remaking that lobby into a very preliminary example of what an Earth Information Center would offer, complete with a board that is constantly bringing information. That's going to be open in about 3 or 4 weeks. And so I want you to come and see it. And it's just an example of something to come. And that something to come is going to be extensive information available at the touch of a click.
Thank you. Arizona's major role in space extends to the private sector, and I'm proud of the diversity of space companies in my state and everything that they're doing and accomplishing for the nation. We have a robust business climate in Arizona and look forward to our commercial space partners' continued success. How does NASA plan to invest in the commercial space industry through large programs like Moon to Mars or Artemis that will drive innovation and competition?
Everything that we're doing is being approached in this commercial public-private partnership. So if it's the example that Senator Lujan was talking about of going to the moon, we have a public-private partnership. The government is going to get there with Artemis, with the capsule Orion. But then a commercial lander is going to rendezvous and dock, and the lander is going to take the crew to the surface. We see that in science. We see the commercial partnerships that are being done. Another example is the senator from Colorado, Senator Hickenlooper, was talking about this Colorado private startup company. They've got an instrument in this new orbit that we're going into at the moon that is polar, it's elliptical, and we've never been in that kind of orbit. We're doing it because we're going to have constant ability to communicate with our spacecraft at the moon, because it's not going behind the backside of the moon where we'd lose radio contact. A California startup instrument put up by a private rocket company is what has that instrument in that unusual orbit called the NHRO orbit.
Thank you. Senator Rosen?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you calling on me. And of course, Administrator Nelson, Senator Nelson, it's so good to see you here today and hear all the great things that you're working on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some things going on in Nevada, because we have an area called Railroad Valley, which is NASA has been asking for a land withdrawal on that. And so last month, the Bureau of Land Management has approved NASA's application for the withdrawal of over 22,000 acres of public land in Railroad Valley. This area is located in Nye County. It's being used by NASA for calibrating satellites. My team's been told that this site is the only one of its kind in the United States and benefits critical research and national security initiatives. However, this area of Nevada is also rich with lithium and other critical minerals, and a number of clean energy companies are also looking to pursue projects there. These projects could help provide our domestic supply chain with critical minerals and further our clean energy goals. So I'm therefore disappointed that up until now, and the withdrawal announcement just last month, my office, Nye County, and other stakeholders have had a very difficult time learning about NASA's land request and getting in touch with your agency. You know, over 80% of Nevada's land is federal, so communication for us is key in ensuring responsible multiple use land management. And so will you commit to improving NASA's communication about this effort with my office, Nye County, and other stakeholders as we look at the Railroad Valley land withdrawal and see what the impact is, and really work with Bureau of Land Management with the entities that are interested in developing there as well?
Let me define the problem and give you the background. What does this area do? It is flat and it has a reflective value because of the composition of the soil, that there are only 3 places in the world that have this: Nevada, China, and Libya, 3 others outside of the United States, including Israel. Israel, China, Libya, and this site, of which we calibrate our satellites by being able to beam to the Earth, and those beams come back in order for the satellite to be doing whatever it does. That includes the DoD and the NRO. In other words, the defense and the intelligence missions. Now, from a matter of national security, and certainly for the operation of civilian satellites that we operate, we think this is of such an importance that the United States would not have this access if we were to rely on trying to go to China to do this, or Libya, or for that matter, our ally Israel. And as a result, it's essential from a standpoint of national security. Now, your mining companies think that there is lithium there, and that ought to be explored, but not at the expense of our national security. And indeed, we have talked to your staff, certainly this committee staff, about this issue. Back last year, Senator Cortez Masto called me, and we talked at length about this very project. And to your question, am I committed to continue talking to you? Yes, ma'am, I certainly am. And maybe I ought to come out there to Nevada and the two of us go take a look at this. And I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, we welcome you coming to Nevada. Like I said, over 80% of our land is managed by, it's all public land, and so many different agencies have access to that. In the meantime, we also have to live with all of that and try to be sure that we're doing the right thing for national security and safety and for our folks in Nevada who live there. So I welcome your visit and to continue this conversation on this and on other issues with aeronautical research and the EP score and other things in STEM as well. So we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Administrator Nelson, we are always happy to see you and appreciate that you're there today. I do have a couple of questions for you. Oak Ridge National Labs, as you are well aware, they are leading the charge on R&D when it comes to new materials, fuels, control solutions that are necessary for the nuclear thermal propulsion program and the success of that program. So what I'd like to hear from you as NASA and DARPA move forward with this interagency agreement, how will these two agencies continue to work through R&D that is critical to this program? How are they going to leverage the national labs and continue to work with them so there's a continuum and a process for this research? And how are they going to leverage that research from our national labs to be certain that we meet those programmatic goals?
Senator, this research is absolutely critical for us exploring the heavens. Under conventional technology, chemical propulsion, it would take us 6, 8, depending on the alignment of the planets, 10 months to get to Mars. We just simply can't sustain a crew for that long, get to Mars, and then have to stay on the surface of Mars for a year or 2 years until the planets realigned in order for us to get back to Earth in the same amount of time. And so we got to go faster. Nuclear thermal and nuclear electric are the two propulsions that can get us there a lot faster. May I say that for the first time last year, we were able to get in the president's budget, albeit the Congress has been authorizing nuclear thermal research money, but we got everybody on the same page now, all asking for these technologies to be developed. Nuclear thermal, as you just pointed out, is the first one out of the gate. And it is a joint project between DARPA and NASA. By the way, this is low enriched uranium. This is not weapons grade uranium. And the heat that comes from that enriched, enriched, goes into making nuclear thermal propulsion, or the other one, nuclear electric. It's my hope that we're going to get a joint project with other agencies that will start working on nuclear electric. But there in Tennessee, you are involved with nuclear thermal, and that is underway as we speak.
Well, and I think we all look at this and we know for Space Force to be successful, we have to pick up the pace. And this, I want to ask you also about the unmanned aircraft systems, because your reauthorization last year gave you the opportunity to work in this space. And as you are doing some research work on the UAS, I would love to hear from you. We know the Chinese are very aggressive in this. Are you working with any Chinese drone manufacturers or not? What is your participation? Is there private sector participation with you in this program?
Yes, ma'am. We are seeing in front of our eyes the change of air transport and mobility as a result of drones. Not only are we seeing the commercial use of these drones, but we're going to see the transport of humans, particularly in the urban setting. So if you want to go from downtown Washington to Dulles and you don't want to fight all the traffic, you'll be able to get on a human-rated drone that will lift off, electric propulsion, and will take you out to Dulles. This will remake transportation in the urban setting and even short.
And are you working with any Chinese manufacturers or any Chinese-based research in these programs?
Not to my knowledge. As a matter of fact,
Will you look further into that and confirm to us either yes or no?
Of course, but let me
Awesome.
say that we are well down the road working with American companies on this air mobility.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Administrator Nelson, thank you so much for your participation today. The hearing record will remain open for 4 weeks until June 13th of 2023. Any senators that would like to submit questions for the record should do so 2 weeks from now by May 30th of 2023. We ask that responses be returned to the committee by June 13th, 2023. And with that, our hearing is concluded.